In the summer of 1971, every farmer in Chickasaw County, Iowa, grew corn. This was not a decision any of them had made, not recently anyway. It was something that had been decided long before most of them were born, decided by the soil and the market and the men who came before them, and it had been decided so completely and so finely that it no longer felt like a decision at all. It felt like weather. It felt like the angle of the earth. It felt like something you would have to be a fool or a stranger to question. And in Chickasaw County in 1971, those two categories were considered largely the same thing. The county sat in the northeastern corner of Iowa, where the upper Iowa River cut through limestone bluffs and the land flattened out into some of the richest tillable soil on the continent. Black dirt, deep, heavy, patient dirt that had been building itself for 10,000 years and had been growing corn for the last 100. The grain elevator in New Hampton stood taller than anything else in town, and it was full every October, and the men who filled it were proud of that, and they had reason to be. Corn was what Chickasaw County did. Corn was what Chickasaw County was. Let me tell you about the Hassel family, because you need to understand them before you can understand what happened in 1971, and what happened in 1979, and what happened in 1993 in a way that silenced people who'd been talking loudly for a very long time. Gunnar Hassel had come to Chickasaw County from Telemark, Norway, in 1902. He was 23 years old. He had $40 in his coat pocket, and he had a particular way of looking at land that his son Birger inherited, and Birger's son Arvid inherited after him. It was not a romantic way of looking at land. It was a practical way, almost a scientific way, the way a man looks at something he's trying to understand rather than something he's trying to possess. Gunnar had broken 160 acres of raw prairie in his first decade, had paid off his note in 1914, and had left Birger 320 acres, and a rule that Birger repeated to Arvid, and Arvid repeated to his children until it became the closest thing the Hassel family had to a creed. The land will tell you what it wants to grow, if you stop talking long enough to listen. Arvid Hassel farmed 480 acres in 1971. He was 61 years old, broad across the shoulders, slow to speak, and almost constitutionally incapable of the kind of casual certainty that passed for wisdom at the feed store in New Hampton. He grew corn on 400 of his 480 acres. He had grown corn on those 400 acres for 30 years. He grew good corn, consistent corn that yielded 95 to 110 bushels per acre in a normal year, and he was neither the best farmer in Chickasaw County nor the worst. He was a man who paid attention. That was the thing people who knew him said first when they described him. He paid attention. The other 80 acres were the problem, as far as the county was concerned. Those 80 acres sat in the southwestern corner of Arvid's property, in a broad, shallow depression that the locals called the bottom field, and they were wet. Not seasonally wet. Not wet in a way that tile drainage and a good dry summer could fix. Wet in a fundamental, geological way, fed by 3 subsurface springs that Gunnar Hassel had mapped in 1908, and that had been flowing steadily ever since. Arvid had tried to grow corn in the bottom field twice in the 1950s, and both times the stand had drowned before July. He had tried soybeans once in 1963, and the result had been so discouraging that he did not try again. The county extension agent, a methodical man named Don Crowley, who had been given the same advice for 15 years, had told Arvid to tile the field and push it into production, and Arvid had listened politely and done nothing, because Arvid had looked at those 3 springs and understood something that Don Crowley had not, which was that no amount of tile was going to stop water that was coming up from 40 feet below grade. So the bottom field sat. It grew cattails and sedge grass and red-winged blackbirds, and the neighbors drove past it on the county road and shook their heads and said what a shame it was, all that ground going to waste, and Arvid let them shake their heads and said nothing because he was still listening. Let me tell you about the summer of 1971, because that is when the listening produced something. Arvid's youngest daughter came home from Iowa State University that June. Her name was Linnea Hassel. She was 22 years old. She had just completed her 2nd year in the agronomy program, and she carried a green canvas notebook that she had been filling since her freshman year with notes from lectures and papers and conversations with a professor named Dr. Carl Peterson, who taught aquatic ecology and who had been conducting field trials in southern Louisiana that nobody in Chickasaw County had heard of or would have cared about if they had. Linnea was the 3rd of Arvid's 4 children. Her 2 older brothers, Eric and Gunnar, named for the great-grandfather, had taken over the northern and eastern fields and farmed them the way their father had taught them, which was carefully and without drama. Her younger brother Sven was 16 and still in school. Linnea was the one who had left, and she was the one who had come back with a notebook and an idea that she was afraid to say out loud. She is different from every other character this channel has told you about, not because she was young, though she was, not because she was a woman, though in Chickasaw County in 1971 that was its own kind of obstacle. She was different because she had taken the Hassel family's way of looking at land, that patient, scientific, listening way, and had carried it to a university and had it sharpened into something with edges. She had come home with a theory, and the theory was about the bottom field. Let me tell you about the science, because it is the reason this story exists, and you need to understand it before you can understand what Linnea proposed at the kitchen table that August evening. Red swamp crawfish, Procambarus clarkii, are not native to Iowa. They are native to the Gulf Coast, to the bayous and slow-moving water of Louisiana and Mississippi, where Cajun farmers had been cultivating them in flooded rice paddies for generations. What Dr. Carl Peterson had been studying, and what he had shared with Linnea in a series of late-afternoon conversations in his office that she had written down in her green notebook with the precision of someone who understood she was being told something important, was that crawfish aquaculture could be conducted in flooded fields as far north as the upper Midwest under the right conditions. The conditions were specific. Standing water of 8 to 14 inches, a subsurface spring or consistent recharge source to maintain temperature and oxygen levels, vegetation to provide cover and food, and a growing season that ran from late spring through early fall. Crawfish could be harvested at 400 to 600 pounds per acre in a well-managed pond. The wholesale price in 1971 was running between 35 and 55 cents per pound, depending on the month and the buyer. The Chicago restaurant market had been growing steadily since the mid-1960s, and buyers were driving into Iowa and Illinois looking for supply that didn't have to come from Louisiana on a refrigerated truck. Linnea had done the arithmetic in her notebook. She had done it several times, from several angles, the way her father had taught her to check a calculation. 80 acres at 400 pounds per acre was 32,000 pounds. At 40 cents per pound, that was $12,800 in a single season from ground that was currently producing nothing. The bottom field, the 80 acres that the county had been pitying for 20 years, had 3 subsurface springs feeding it continuously. It already held water. It already grew the aquatic vegetation that crawfish needed. It was not a liability. It was infrastructure. It was a crawfish pond that nobody had bothered to finish building. She told her father this on a Tuesday evening in August of 1971. Arvid had come in from the field at 7 o'clock, washed his hands at the kitchen sink, and sat down at the table where her mother, Ingrid, had put a plate of pork chops and boiled potatoes. Linnea sat across from him and opened her notebook and explained what she had learned and what she had calculated and what she thought they should do with the bottom field. Arvid listened without interrupting, which was his way. He ate 2 pork chops and most of his potatoes, and looked at the notebook and looked at his daughter and looked at the notebook again. The kitchen went quiet. Ingrid stopped moving at the counter. Sven set down his fork. Arvid said, "Where would you sell them?" Linnea said she had already written a letter to a produce distributor in Waterloo who had a contract with 3 restaurants in Chicago, and that she had received a letter back expressing serious interest if she could guarantee consistent supply from June through September. Arvid looked at the table for a long time. Then he said, "I need to think about it," which, for Arvid Hassel, was not a no. Ingrid waited until Arvid had gone out to the porch, and then she looked at Linnea and said, "You know the numbers are right. He knows the numbers are right. Give him a week." It took 10 days. On the second Saturday of September, Arvid walked out to the bottom field with Linnea and stood at the edge of the cattails and looked at the water standing in the low places and said, "You can have 40 acres. The south half. If it works, we'll talk about the rest." That was the permission. 40 acres, half of what she had calculated. But it was a start, and Linnea Hassel was 22 years old, and she had been waiting for it, and she went back to Ames that fall and spent the rest of her junior year planning. Now let me tell you about the man who laughed, because every story like this one has a man who laughs, and in Chickasaw County in 1972, that man was Gene Sievert. Gene Sievert was 54 years old and had been the county's largest corn seed dealer for 18 years. He operated out of a low brick building on the south end of New Hampton, where farmers came in the fall to talk about the next year's seed selection. And Gene held court at a counter stool the way some men hold court at a bar, with the particular authority of someone who has been right about the same thing enough times in a row that being right has started to feel like a personality trait. He was not a bad man. He was a man who had built his certainty the way you build a fence, post by post, year by year, and who had been inside that fence for so long that he had stopped noticing it was there. Linnea came into the feed store in March of 1972 to buy supplies for the pond preparation. She was buying nothing Gene sold. She needed to pick up a bag of fencing staples and a roll of hardware cloth from the back wall, and she would have been in and out in 4 minutes if Gene had not been standing at the counter with 3 other men when she walked in. Gene Sievert looked at what she was carrying and said, "I heard Arvid's girl was going to grow crawdads in the bottom field." He said it the way you say something when you want the room to know you've already thought about it and found it funny. "Crawdads," he said again, slower, as if the word itself was the joke. The silence lasted about 2 seconds. Then Gene started laughing, and the 2 men at the counter laughed with him, and the third man, a quiet farmer named Hollis Peterson, who had known Arvid Hassel for 30 years, looked at the floor. Now, let me pause here and ask you something. What is that laugh? What is it actually made of? Because it is not simple. It is not just cruelty, though there is some of that in it. It is not just ignorance, though there is some of that too. That laugh is the sound of offense. It is the sound of a man who has organized his entire understanding of what a farm is, and what a farm does, and who a farmer is, and who has just heard something that does not fit inside that organization, and who has chosen, in the space of 2 seconds, to laugh at the thing rather than to consider it. Gene Sievert was not laughing at Linnea Hassel. He was laughing at the idea that the bottom field could be anything other than what it had always been. He was laughing at the notebook. He was laughing at Louisiana. He was laughing at the possibility that a 22-year-old woman who had gone to college and come home with an idea might know something that he did not. Linnea set the hardware cloth on the counter and paid for it, and picked it up and said, without raising her voice, "The wholesale price for crawfish in Chicago is 40 cents a pound this spring. My field will put out 400 pounds an acre. You do the math on 40 acres and tell me what's funny." She picked up her bag and walked out. Gene watched her go. His smile was still there, but it had gotten smaller. Let me tell you about the spring of 1972, because that is when the work began in earnest. Arvid and Sven helped Linnea prepare the south 40 acres of the bottom field that April. They pushed the existing cattail stands back from the center of the field with a small dozer that Arvid borrowed from a neighbor, leaving a ring of natural vegetation around the perimeter for cover and water quality. They built a low earthen levee along the northern edge to hold water at a consistent 10-inch depth, using the natural topography of the depression to do most of the work. The 3 springs fed the pond from below, and Linnea had calculated, correctly as it turned out, that the recharge rate was sufficient to maintain oxygen levels without mechanical aeration in a field that size. They ordered juvenile crawfish from a supplier in Lafayette, Louisiana, that Dr. Peterson had recommended, 200 pounds of seed stock at $1.20 a pound, which came packed in wet burlap in a refrigerated truck that the driver had clearly not expected to be delivering to a farm in northeastern Iowa. Linnea stocked the pond in late April. She kept records from the first day: water temperature, dissolved oxygen readings taken with a kit she had bought through the university, crawfish sightings per linear foot of shoreline, vegetation coverage. She had a clipboard where her father had a tractor, and she was out at the pond every morning before breakfast and every evening before dark, and she wrote everything down. The county noticed. Not in the way you want to be noticed when you're trying something new. They noticed the way people notice something they find peculiar. Drivers slowed on the county road. Men at the elevator mentioned it. The county extension agent, Don Crowley, drove out in May and stood at the levee and looked at the water and said, with the particular gentleness of someone delivering bad news, that he was not aware of any successful crawfish operations this far north, and that he would hate to see the Hassel family lose money on an experiment. Linnea thanked him for stopping and showed him her water temperature logs, which were running warmer than the Louisiana literature predicted, because the springs brought up groundwater that was a consistent 52 degrees year-round and moderated the pond temperature in both directions. Don Crowley looked at the logs and nodded slowly and said he'd be interested to see how it went. That first summer was not a triumph. Let me be honest about that, because the story is more true if I am. The crawfish established themselves and grew, but the yield that first September was 280 pounds per acre, not the 400 Linnea had projected. The problem was predation. Great blue herons which stood in the shallows and ate crawfish with the systematic patience of professionals, and which Linnea had not fully accounted for in her planning. She lost an estimated 30% of her harvestable crop to herons before she could get wire exclosures in place. Total harvest, 11,200 pounds from 40 acres. revenue at 38 cents per pound, $4,256. Gene Sievert heard the number and said, at the feed store counter in October, that he'd told everyone it wouldn't work. But Linnea Hassel was not done. She was 23 years old, and she had a green notebook and a field full of established crawfish burrows, and she'd learned more in one summer about heron behavior and crawfish population dynamics and water management than most people learn in a decade of trying the same thing over and over. She went back to Ames that fall and talked to Dr. Peterson and wrote 12 pages of notes about what she would do differently. And when she came home for Christmas, she sat down with her father and showed him the corrected projections. Arvid listened. He looked at the numbers. He looked at the heron exclosure designs she had sketched in the notebook. He said, "You can have the other 40 acres. Let me tell you about the years that followed, because the story doesn't end with the first harvest, and the proof that mattered didn't come until much later." In 1973, Linnea graduated from Iowa State with her agronomy degree and came home to Chickasaw County and did not leave again. She was 24 years old, and she had turned down a position with the University Extension Service because she had 80 acres of bottom field and a theory she was not finished testing. She installed wire exclosures along the perimeter of the expanded pond in April, a grid of hardware cloth and wooden stakes that took 3 weeks to set, and that her brother Sven helped her finish on a cold morning in early May. She adjusted her stocking density based on the previous year's data. She planted additional aquatic vegetation, American pondweed and coontail, to increase food availability and cover. The 1973 harvest was 390 pounds per acre. 80 acres, 31,200 pounds total. The wholesale price had risen to 44 cents per pound, driven by a supply shortage from Louisiana, where a late-season flood had damaged several commercial operations. Total revenue, $13,728. That number moved through Chickasaw County like weather. Farmers drove past the bottom field more slowly. A few stopped and got out of their trucks and looked. Don Crowley, the extension agent, came back in October, and this time he brought a notepad and asked Linnea detailed questions about her water management and stocking protocols, and he wrote down everything she said. Gene Sievert did not come. But the laughter at the feed store counter had gotten quieter. In 1974, Arvid told Linnea that she could make her own decisions about the bottom field. Not, "I need to think about it." Not, "You can have 40 acres. He said, "You decide what happens down there." He said it at the dinner table on a Sunday in March, and Ingrid looked up from her plate and nodded once, and Sven grinned, and Linnea wrote the date in her notebook. The years from 1974 to 1978 were years of refinement and expansion. Linnea converted the entire 80 acres to managed crawfish production. She negotiated a direct contract with the Waterloo distributor, bypassing the spot market, which gave her a guaranteed price of 46 cents per pound for a minimum of 25,000 pounds per season. She hired 2 part-time workers from a neighboring farm family during harvest season, the Marquez brothers, who learned the trapping and grading protocols in their first summer and became indispensable by their second. She began giving informal talks at the county extension office, not because anyone invited her, but because Don Crowley had started telling farmers about the bottom field, and farmers had started asking questions and someone needed to answer them. By 1977, Linnea was averaging 420 pounds per acre across 80 acres. Revenue per season was running between $15,000 and $17,000 from ground that had produced nothing for 20 years. She was 28 years old. She owned the bottom field outright. Arvid had transferred the deed in 1975 as a birthday gift, and she had paid off the initial infrastructure investment in her third year of operation. Jean Sievert had stopped talking about crawdads at the feed store counter. This was noticed. But let me tell you about 1979, because 1979 was the year the county stopped being politely skeptical and started being quietly attentive. The winter of 1978 to 79 was brutal across the Midwest. The corn crop had been good in 1978, but the spring of 1979 brought flooding along the upper Iowa River that damaged or destroyed an estimated 15% of Chickasaw County's planted acreage before the end of June. Corn prices were volatile. Input costs, fuel, fertilizer, seed, had been climbing since the energy crisis, and the cost per acre for corn production in Chickasaw County in 1979 was running between $180 and $210. At the prevailing corn price of $2.40 per bushel, a farmer needed to yield at least 75 bushels per acre to break even, and the flood-damaged fields were coming in at 40 to 60. Linnea's bottom field flooded too. Of course it did. It was already flooded. The spring rains raised the water level in the pond by 4 inches and held it there for 6 weeks, which was outside her normal management parameters, and she lost approximately 18% of her juvenile stock to the elevated water. She spent 3 weeks in May and June managing the levee and monitoring oxygen levels and doing the work of keeping the pond functional under conditions she had not designed for. It was hard work. She did not complain about it. Her 1979 harvest was 370 pounds per acre, down from her average. Revenue was $13,690, which was her second lowest year since 1973. The corn farmers of Chickasaw County in 1979 averaged $47 per acre in net profit on their dryland fields. On their flood-affected fields, many of them lost money. Several farms that had been marginal going into the year came out of 1979, carrying debt they had not carried before. Linnea Hassel's 80 acres of. In the summer of 1977, in Chickasaw County, Iowa, every farmer planted corn. Not some farmers, not most farmers, every farmer. From the gravel roads along the Cedar River to the flat black ground north of New Hampton, the fields ran green and gold in rows as straight and certain as the county lines themselves. Corn was not a crop in Chickasaw County. It was a fact of life. The same way the river was a fact and the winters were a fact and the way a man's worth was measured in bushels per acre was a fact. Nobody chose it. It had simply always been, and because it had always been, nobody thought to ask whether it should be. Let me tell you about the Holloway farm, because you need to understand it before you can understand what happened there, and what happened there is the reason this story is still being told 40 years later. The Holloway farm sat on 340 acres of mixed ground east of Ionia, Iowa, a small town that barely registered on a state map and barely needed to. 340 acres sounds like a lot until you understand that roughly 60 of those acres occupied the low ground along the creek bottom, a wide, shallow depression that flooded every spring without fail, drained slowly through June, and grew corn with the kind of reluctant mediocrity that made a farmer feel like he was arguing with the land itself. Elmer Holloway, who was 51 years old in 1977 and had farmed that same ground since he was 19, had planted corn in that bottom field for 32 years. He had pulled decent yields out of it in dry years and watched it drown in wet ones. He had tiled it, ditched it, and prayed over it with the patient resignation of a man who believed the land owed him something and was waiting for it to pay up. Elmer's father, Clarence Holloway, had planted corn in that bottom before him. Clarence's father, August, had broken the sod there in 1908 with a team of Belgian drafts and a single-bottom plow, and he had grown corn then too, because that was what the ground was for, and that was what the market wanted, and that was what every neighbor for 20 miles in any direction was doing. The Holloways were good farmers, methodical, patient, unflashy. Elmer kept his equipment clean and his fence rows tight and his yield records in a green ledger he stored on the shelf above the kitchen table. He was not a man who complained. He was not a man who second-guessed. He was a man who did what the land and the market and the county extension office told him to do, and he did it well, and that was enough. Or it had been enough. In 1976, the bottom field gave him 74 bushels per acre, which was 30 bushels below the county average and barely enough to cover his input costs. In 1975, it had flooded in May, and he had replanted in late June and harvested 61 bushels of corn that was more suitable for compost than for the elevator. In 1974, a wet August had brought gray leaf blight through the county, and the bottom field, sitting low and damp as it always did, had been the first to show it and the worst to suffer it. 3 years of bad returns on 60 acres was not a crisis for a man with 340 total, but it was the kind of persistent bleeding that a careful farmer felt in his sleep. Let me tell you about Nora Holloway, because she is the reason this story exists, and she is different from every character this channel has told you about. Not because she was a woman, though in 1977 in Chickasaw County, Iowa, that alone was enough to make people look twice at anything she said. Not because she was young, though she was 22 years old in the spring of 1977, and had just finished 2 years at Iowa State University studying agricultural science before running out of money and coming home. She is different because she walked back onto that farm with a notebook full of ideas that the county had never considered, and the patience to prove every single one of them, one season at a time, against the weight of everything her neighbors believed to be true. Nora was Elmer's daughter. She was the second of 4 children, the only one who had gone to college, and the only one who had come back to the farm with any intention of changing it. Her brothers, Gerald and Dennis, were good farm boys who did what their father told them and thought the way their father thought, which was the way their grandfather had thought, which was the way the ground itself seemed to think. Corn in spring, harvest in fall, repeat until dead. Her younger sister had married a man in Waterloo and was done with farming entirely. Nora had come home in December of 1976, moved back into her childhood bedroom, and started asking questions that nobody in Chickasaw County had thought to ask. She had a professor at Iowa State named Dr. Harlan Voss, who taught agricultural economics and who had spent a decade studying alternative crop systems in the upper Midwest. Voss was not a famous man. He was not a man who appeared on television or published in magazines that farmers actually read. He was a quiet, precise academic who kept files on every experimental crop trial conducted in the north-central states between 1940 and 1975. And he had shared those files with Nora during her second year because she was the only student in his class who had asked for them. Those files contained data from crawfish aquaculture trials conducted in Louisiana in the 1950s and 1960s, from rice crawfish rotation experiments in Arkansas in the early 1970s, and from a single, largely ignored study conducted by the University of Minnesota in 1972 that had tested shallow-water crawfish production in low-lying agricultural ground in the northern Midwest. The Minnesota study had concluded that crawfish production in flooded bottomland could generate between 400 and 900 pounds per acre in a single season, and that the market, thin as it was in the Midwest in 1972, was growing. Nora had read that study 4 times. She had written to the researcher, a Dr. Elaine Tesdall at the University of Minnesota, and received a 3-page letter in return that answered her questions and raised 6 more. She had filled one notebook and started a second. She had come home in December with a plan that she believed in, the way you believe in something when the numbers keep agreeing with you no matter how many times you check them. Let me tell you about what she proposed, because you need to understand the science before you can understand why people laughed. And you need to understand why people laughed before you can understand what the numbers eventually said. The bottom field on the Holloway farm flooded every spring. This was not a problem Nora wanted to solve. This was a resource she wanted to use. Crawfish, specifically the northern species Orconectes immunis, which was native to Iowa waterways and already present in the Cedar River drainage, could be raised in shallow flooded fields between April and August. They required water depths of 8 to 18 inches, which the bottom field provided naturally for most of the spring. They fed on decaying organic matter, aquatic vegetation, and the residue of the previous crop, which meant that the corn stalks and root matter Elmer had been plowing under every spring were, in Nora's framework, not waste, but feed. They could be harvested by trap or by seine in late July and early August when water levels dropped. And then, this was the part that made the plan more than a novelty, the field could be drained, dried, and planted to a late cover crop of winter rye or hairy vetch that would fix nitrogen in the soil through the fall and winter, reducing fertilizer costs for whatever came next. The per-acre economics, as Nora had calculated them from the Minnesota study and from Louisiana production data she had requested from the LSU Agricultural Center, were not complicated. 60 acres of bottomland producing 500 pounds of crawfish per acre at the current Midwest wholesale price of 35 cents per pound would generate $10,500 in gross revenue. Against that, the input costs, trapping equipment, pumping infrastructure, stocking fingerlings in year 1, licensing, came to roughly $3,200 in the first year and considerably less in subsequent years. Compare that to 60 acres of marginal corn at 70 bushels per acre and $2.30 per bushel, which generated $9,660 in gross revenue against input costs of roughly $4,800, leaving a net of $4,860 on a good year and far less on a bad one. The crawfish system, by Nora's math, could net $7,300 in year 1 and improve from there as she refined the operation and as the market, which was growing in Chicago and Minneapolis and St. Paul, continued to expand. She had brought this to the kitchen table in February of 1977. Elmer had set down his fork. Gerald had stopped chewing. Dennis had looked at his plate. Nora's mother, Ruth, had listened to the whole presentation without speaking, and when Nora finished, Ruth had said, quietly, that the numbers looked right to her, and that someone ought to at least think about it seriously. Elmer said he needed to think about it. He said that more than once over the following 2 weeks, and Nora understood that this was not a delay but a process. Her father was a man who made decisions slowly and kept them forever, and she'd rather have his slow yes than his fast no. In March, Elmer said she could flood the bottom field. He did not say she was right. He said she could try it on the bottom 60 and they would see what the numbers looked like in September. Now, let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever had a good idea that you couldn't make anyone believe in? Have you ever held a number in your hand that was as clear as daylight and watched someone look straight at it and see nothing? That is what Nora Holloway was about to experience, and it happened in the way these things always happen in small counties, publicly, casually, and with a smile that was meant to be friendly and wasn't. Let me tell you about Dale Crowley because you need to understand him before you can understand the laugh. And the laugh is the reason the rest of this story matters the way it does. Dale Crowley was 58 years old in 1977 and had been the Agway dealer in New Hampton for 22 years. He was not a bad man. He was a man who had succeeded by understanding what farmers in Chickasaw County needed, and what they needed, in his experience, was corn seed, nitrogen fertilizer, and someone to tell them that what they were doing was correct. He held court at the co-op counter every Tuesday and Thursday morning, and the farmers who came in for coffee and supplies generally left having confirmed their existing beliefs, which was exactly what they came for. Crowley knew every farm in the county by its yield history. He knew Elmer Holloway's bottom field. He had sold Elmer seed corn for that field for 15 years and had watched the yields disappoint and had told Elmer every year that next year would be better and that the answer was a higher-yielding hybrid and more starter fertilizer at planting. Nora came into the Agway in April of 1977 to ask about water pump rental and to inquire whether Crowley knew anything about crawfish fingerling suppliers in the upper Midwest. She had her notebook with her. She was wearing her Iowa State jacket, which she would later understand had been a mistake in that particular room on that particular morning. Crowley listened to her for about 90 seconds. He let her get through the part about the flooded field and the crawfish and the Minnesota study, and then he did the thing that people in positions of comfortable authority do when they encounter an idea that threatens their understanding of the world. He smiled. Not a mean smile, not a contemptuous smile. A patient, indulgent smile that said he had seen young people come home from college before, and he had watched their ideas dissolve in the first hard season, and he expected this would be no different. He said, "Honey, this is Iowa. We grow corn here." There were 4 other men at the counter that morning. 2 of them laughed. One of them shook his head. One of them said nothing but looked at his coffee cup in a way that was its own kind of dismissal. Nora said, "I know what grows here. I'm asking about what could grow here." She said it without raising her voice. She said it the way someone says something when they've already decided that the argument isn't worth having in this room, because the room has already made up its mind, and the only evidence that will change it is the kind that arrives in September with a price tag attached. She asked again about the pump rental. Crowley told her he didn't stock crawfish fingerlings and didn't know who did, and that she might want to call the university if she was serious, and his tone suggested he did not believe she was serious. She drove home on the county road and did not mention the conversation to her father. She had already ordered fingerlings from a supplier in Missouri she had found through Dr. Testall's letter. She had already rented a pump from a dealer in Waterloo. She had already drawn the water management plan for the bottom field in her second notebook, showing inlet points, depth gradients, and trap placement. The laugh at the co-op counter had not changed any of those plans. It had only confirmed that the proof would need to be in the numbers, and that the numbers would need to be undeniable. Let me tell you about the spring of 1977, because it matters more than you might think. Elmer's neighbors drove past the Holloway farm on the county road in April and May and saw the bottom field sitting under 8 inches of water, which was not unusual for that time of year. What was unusual was that Elmer was not fighting it. He was not pumping it dry or cursing the drainage tile or planning a late replant. He was walking the edges with his daughter, checking water levels with a marked stake, adjusting the inlet from the creek with a hand-dug berm that Nora had designed to maintain consistent depth. The neighbors slowed down. Some of them stopped. A few of them asked Elmer what he was doing, and Elmer said, in the way he said most things, that they were trying something new. He did not elaborate. He had not fully committed to the idea in his own mind, but he had given his word to let it run, and Elmer Holloway's word was not a provisional thing. Gerald thought it was a waste of the bottom ground. Dennis didn't say much either way. Ruth watched from the kitchen window in the mornings and said nothing except, once, to Nora, that she hoped the traps were strong enough to hold what was coming. The fingerlings arrived in late April, 18,000 of them in aerated transport bags from the Missouri supplier, each one smaller than a thumbnail, each one representing a calculation Nora had run 4 times to confirm the stocking density was right for the depth and organic load of the field. She stocked them herself, wading in rubber boots through the shallow water in the early morning, releasing them in batches along the western edge where the decomposing corn stalks from the previous year's crop were thickest. She checked the traps twice a week through May and June, recording catch rates, water temperature, and dissolved oxygen levels in her notebook. The field was alive in a way it had never been when it was growing marginal corn. Red-winged blackbirds worked the edges. Herons stood motionless in the shallows. The water had a greenish tint from the algae that was feeding the crawfish that were feeding on everything the field had left behind. Dale Crowley drove past the Holloway farm on a Tuesday in June on his way to a customer north of Ionia and saw the field still flooded. He mentioned it at the co-op that Thursday. He said Elmer Holloway had let his daughter talk him into drowning 60 acres of bottomland to raise crawfish, and the way he said it left no room for the possibility that this might be a reasonable decision. The men at the counter discussed it the way they discussed most things, with the comfortable certainty of people who have never had to be wrong about anything that mattered. Let me tell you about the harvest, because the harvest is where the notebook stopped being a notebook and started being a record. In late July of 1977, Nora began pulling traps. The first week's catch from 12 traps ran 340 pounds. She recorded it. The second week ran 410 pounds. She recorded that. By the middle of August, when the water level had dropped naturally to 4 inches, and she began the final sane harvest, with Gerald's reluctant help and Dennis's more reluctant help, and Elmer standing at the edge of the field watching with his arms crossed, the total harvest from 60 acres came to 31,200 pounds. She had projected 30,000. She had been low. She had already arranged a buyer. Dr. Tesdall had connected her with a seafood distributor in Minneapolis, who was supplying crawfish to restaurants in the Twin Cities and Chicago, a market that was growing faster than the supply could keep up with. The price she had negotiated was 38 cents per pound, 3 cents above her original projection, because the distributor had not expected a reliable northern supplier and was willing to pay a premium for consistency. 31,200 pounds at 38 cents per pound came to $11,856 in gross revenue. Against input costs of $3,340 in the first year, the net was $8,516 on 60 acres of ground that had netted Elmer less than $1,200 in a good corn year and had lost money twice in the previous 5. Elmer looked at the numbers for a long time at the kitchen table that September. He looked at them the way a man looks at something he did not expect to see and is not sure yet what to do with. He set down his pencil. He said, You were right." He said it quietly, the way a careful man says something he has verified 3 times before saying it out loud. Nora said she knew. She did not say it unkindly. She said it the way someone says something when the numbers have been saying it for months, and the words are just catching up. Elmer said, "What do you want to do next year?" And that question, those 6 words, were the most significant thing he said in 1977, because they meant that the 60 acres was no longer his decision alone. He was asking her. He was handing her the rotation. She said she wanted to run the Crawfish again on the bottom 60, drain it in August, plant winter rye as a cover crop, and use the nitrogen credit in the spring to reduce fertilizer costs on the adjacent corn ground. She also said she wanted to look at a second low-lying parcel on the east side of the farm, another 22 acres that had similar flooding characteristics, and consider expanding the aquaculture operation. Elmer said, "You decide the rotation." He went back to his ledger. Ruth, who had been sitting at the other end of the table pretending to read a seed catalog, looked up and caught Nora's eye and nodded once, slowly, in the way of a woman who had been waiting a long time for something to be confirmed. Let me tell you about the years that followed, because the story doesn't end in 1977. And in fact, 1977 was only the beginning of what the numbers were building toward. In 1978, Nora ran the bottom 60 again and expanded to the east 22 acres. Combined harvest came to 47,800 pounds. The Minneapolis distributor increased his order and introduced her to a second buyer in Chicago who was supplying Cajun-style restaurants that had opened in the city during the late 1970s and were finding that crawfish from Louisiana were expensive to ship and inconsistent in quality. Nora's crawfish were neither. They were raised in clean Iowa water, harvested on a consistent schedule, and delivered fresh because the drive to Minneapolis was 4 hours and the drive to Chicago was 5. By 1979, the Holloway crawfish operation was generating more revenue per acre on the bottom ground than the corn ground above it was generating on its best acres. The community reaction during those years was not hostile, exactly. It was the reaction of people who have decided something is a curiosity and are waiting for it to fail so they can return to their previous certainty. Farmers drove past the flooded fields and shook their heads. Their wives asked Ruth at church whether it smelled, and Ruth said it smelled like a creek, which it did. Dale Crowley mentioned the Holloway crawfish operation at the co-op counter with the regularity of a man who has a running joke he hasn't quite decided to retire. He said in the spring of 1979 that he'd give it one more year before the girl figured out that Iowa wasn't Louisiana. He said this to a group of 7 farmers, and one of them, a man named Lyle Peterson, who farmed 600 acres south of New Hampton, said nothing but drove home by way of the county road that ran past the Holloway farm and slowed down as he passed the flooded field and looked at it for a long time before continuing on. In 1980, Nora added a third parcel. In 1981, she began selling directly to restaurants in Des Moines, cutting out the distributor on a portion of her volume and improving her margin. In 1982, she hired 2 part-time workers for harvest season. Both of them farm kids who needed summer work and who told their fathers about what they were doing. And their fathers mentioned it at the co-op, and the co-op conversation began. Slowly, and without anyone quite admitting it, to shift from jokes about crawfish to questions about crawfish. Now, let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever watched a community change its mind? It doesn't happen the way you'd expect. It doesn't happen in a single moment of public acknowledgement. It happens the way water moves through soil, slowly, invisibly, and then all at once when the conditions are right. The conditions in Chickasaw County were not right until 1993. But when they arrived with the force of something that had been building for 16 years. Let me tell you about 1993, because 1993 is the year that answered every question the county had been refusing to ask. The winter of 1992 to 1993 was wet across the upper Midwest. The spring of 1993 was wetter. The Mississippi River and its tributaries ran high through April and May, and by June, the Cedar River, which drained much of Chickasaw County, was at flood stage and staying there. The flooding of 1993 was not a brief inconvenience. It was a sustained, catastrophic inundation that kept low-lying fields underwater through June and into July, well past the last possible date for corn replanting in Iowa. Farmers who had planted in May watched their fields disappear under brown water. Farmers who had waited to plant found they had waited too long. The county extension office estimated that 35% of Chickasaw County's planted corn acres were either destroyed or severely damaged by the flooding. The crop insurance adjusters were in the county for weeks. Let me tell you about what the flooding did to the Holloway Farm's bottom ground, because this is where the 16 years of preparation met the one season that made them matter. The bottom, 60 acres, and the east, 22 acres, were already flooded. They were supposed to be flooded. Nora had managed the water levels through the spring the same way she had managed them every spring since 1977, adjusting inlet berms, monitoring depth, checking oxygen levels. When the Cedar River rose and the county's drainage systems backed up, and the water that was drowning her neighbors' cornfields crept toward the Holloway farm, Nora had already accounted for it. She had built 2 feet of freeboard into her water management infrastructure in 1985 after a wet spring had pushed her depth above optimal range, and that freeboard absorbed the 1993 flood surge without breaching her field boundaries. Her crawfish were fine. Her water depth was higher than ideal for 2 weeks in June, but she had managed it with her pump and her berm system and the operational knowledge she had accumulated over 16 seasons, and by late June the depth was back in range. The corn ground above the bottom, the 258 acres of upland field that Elmer still managed in conventional rotation, suffered. Some of it flooded, some of it was replanted late and came in thin, but the bottom ground, the 60 acres that had been a liability for 30 years before Nora came home, was producing its 16th consecutive crawfish harvest, as if the flood were a weather event and not a catastrophe. The numbers from 1993 told the story in the clearest possible terms. Across Chickasaw County, the average corn yield dropped to 67 bushels per acre on ground that had been averaging 142 bushels in the years prior. At $2.45 per bushel, a farmer with 300 acres of corn averaged roughly $49,000 in gross revenue against input costs that had not decreased proportionally, leaving many operations in the red or barely above it. Crop insurance covered some of the loss. Some farmers had adequate coverage, many did not. The county's total agricultural output for 1993 was the worst it had been since the farm crisis years of the mid-1980s. The Holloway crawfish operation in 1993 harvested 54,600 pounds from 82 acres of managed bottomland. The wholesale price for Midwest crawfish in 1993 had risen to 61 cents per pound, driven by demand from the expanding Cajun restaurant market and by the fact that Louisiana production had its own weather problems that year. 54,600 pounds at 61 cents per pound was $33,306 in gross revenue from the bottom ground alone. Against operating costs of $8,200, the net was $25,106 from 82 acres of ground that would have been underwater and unharvestable in corn. The upland corn ground had a difficult year, but the farm as a whole was profitable. In a county where dozens of operations were filing insurance claims and some were filing for the first time in their farming lives, the Holloway farm posted a profit. Elmer sat at the kitchen table in September of 1993 and looked at the ledger for a long time. He was 67 years old. He had farmed that ground for 48 years. He said, "Your grandfather would not have believed this." Nora said she thought August Holloway probably would have believed it, because August had broken that sod with Belgian drafts and a single-bottom plow and had understood, the way working farmers understand things, that the land told you what it wanted to do if you were willing to listen. Elmer thought about that for a while, and then he said, yes, he probably would have. Ruth was at the other end of the table. She said nothing. She was smiling. Let me tell you about what happened that fall, because the fall of 1993 was the season the county stopped driving past the Holloway farm and started stopping. Lyle Peterson, who had been watching the flooded fields from the county road since 1979, came down the Holloway driveway in October of 1993 and knocked on the door. He was 61 years old and had 600 acres and a bottom parcel of his own that had drowned his corn every wet year for as long as he could remember. He sat at the kitchen table and asked Nora how it worked. She showed him the notebooks. She showed him the yield records and the revenue figures and the water management diagrams. He sat with the notebooks for a long time, turning pages, and then he said he wished he had come down this driveway in 1979 when he'd first thought about it. Nora said it wasn't too late. He said, "No, I suppose it isn't." He planted crawfish on his bottom 40 the following spring. 3 other farmers came to the Holloway farm that fall. 2 more came in the spring of 1994. By 1995, there were 7 crawfish operations in Chickasaw County, all of them on low ground that had been a liability in every wet year anyone could remember, all of them generating revenue on acres that had been generating losses. Nora had become, without quite intending to, the person the county called when it had questions about bottomland management, water depth, stocking density, and buyers. She drove to those farms. She looked at their ground. She answered their questions from the notebooks she had been keeping since 1977. Dale Crowley came to the Holloway farm in November of 1993. He did not call ahead. He drove up the driveway on a gray Tuesday morning and knocked on the door, and Nora answered it, and he stood on the porch with his hands in his coat pockets and said he had been thinking about what she'd been doing for the last 16 years, and he wondered if she could explain it to him. He was 68 years old. He had been at the co-op counter for 38 years. He was not a man who apologized easily or often, and he did not apologize then. But he asked. He stood on her porch and asked, and that was its own kind of acknowledgement. Nora said, "Come in." She put coffee on. She sat him down at the kitchen table with the notebooks and she said, "Do you remember what you told me in April of 1977? He said he didn't recall exactly. She said, "You told me this was Iowa, and we grow corn here." She said it without anger. She said it the way you quote something back to someone when the purpose is not to wound them, but to make sure the lesson has a name. Crowley looked at the table. He said, "I remember something like that." Nora said, "The lesson isn't that crawfish are better than corn. The lesson is that any farm that grows only one thing is a farm that needs only one disaster to fail." She let that sit for a moment. Then she opened the notebook to the 1993 figures and turned it toward him. He read the numbers slowly. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "What do I tell my customers who have bottom ground?" She said, "Tell them to come talk to me." He said he would. He did. Let me tell you about what the years after 1993 built, because the story doesn't end with the flood, and it doesn't end with Crowley on the porch. The years after 1993 built something that nobody in Chickasaw County had expected to build, which was a small but durable alternative agricultural economy on the ground that the county had always considered its worst. By 1998, there were 14 crawfish operations in the county covering approximately 900 acres of bottomland. The Minneapolis and Chicago buyers that Nora had cultivated since the late 1970s were now receiving regular shipments from a Chickasaw County cooperative that Nora had helped organize in 1995, which gave the smaller operators access to the wholesale market she had spent nearly 2 decades building. The co-op's combined revenue in 1998 was $380,000 from ground that, in 1977, had been generating a fraction of that in marginal corn. Nora spoke at the Iowa State University Agricultural Extension Conference in Ames in 1996. She was 41 years old, and she had been farming crawfish in Chickasaw County for 19 years, and she had 2 notebooks full of data that nobody else in the state had. She stood at the podium in a room of extension agents and agricultural economists and county officials, and she presented the Holloway Farm data FRAW,